Hello and welcome to this session. So we're continuing to read Edward Albee's The Zoo Story. So as mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, this play has a universal appeal and there's a way in which it would begin. The larger setting would fit in very well within the non-American situation as well. So this play incidentally was premiered. It premiered in Berlin and along with Brecht play. So we find that we've gone through the play quite in detail and there are particular segments that we had taken a detailed look at. So we continue to look at some of the major themes, some of the major frameworks through which we can analyze this. The difference between Peter's and Jerry's systems as individual, as people who are embedded within socio-cultural frameworks. So we find these peculiar contrasts at work and we can find that this is quite relatable, not just within this setting of this play. There is a larger way in which you can connect this to different other contexts as well. So Peter's normal family, normal in the sense of, there's a wife, 2 kids, 2 pets, yeah. So this, and he's also, he works in the publishing sector. We find that his normalcy, the seeming normalcy of his family, may be contrasted with Jerry's dysfunctional family. And we did take a detailed look at how Jerry presents his own family, and it's entirely dysfunctional. There is almost everything which is part and parcel of his life, and his growing up has never been a smooth affair. There is adultery, there is suicide, and there is a family who cannot take care of even children. So, and there is obviously poverty as well. Yeah. So, in that context, we also see another major difference. We find that the way Peter and Jerry, they project themselves, they talk about their situations, they introduce themselves, even their body language, it reflects the swanky upper middle classness in Peter's self versus Jerry's poverty, yeah, and it reflects in his look, in the way he presents his appearance, his speech. It is very deeply seated in this economic divide. The order that Peter's life is used to, the way he occupies a certain position on the bench, and he also talks about how this has been a routine for him, and the way he holds the book, and the way he is going about his measured words. Yeah, there is a plan and a routine and a system within which everything could be located. And this may be compared with Jerry's messy eccentricity. There is an eccentric quality about his language, about the way he presents himself, about the randomness with which he approaches Peter. And there are also their social behavior, the social codes that they apply in language, in their body language, in the way they engage with strangers. Everything is very different. So Peter comes across as an individual whose sense of propriety is exactly in place. And Jerry, when he begins to talk about his own life, that comes across as very impropriety, very inappropriate, because his life is also about uncomfortable truths. It's also about things which are not acceptable within the normal American system. So in the end, there's this larger contrast as well. Peter's life is preserved intact vis-a-vis Jerry's death. In fact, Peter's life also assumes a kind of validity that it never had before, a certain kind of an adventure that it never had before. He also becomes more like a living being than a vegetable, as Jerry also puts it towards the end, through Jerry's death. So it is in these contrasts that we have also been trying to read this play. If you take a closer look at the kind of language used over here, it's very absurd. Yeah, we never really get to know. The title of the play is The Zoo Story, but as you know, we never really get to know what actually happens at the zoo. It's more like a conversation starter for Jerry. He keeps telling about, I have to tell you about what happened at the zoo, and every story seems to be in an interlude towards, a prelude towards what happened at the zoo. So there is very poor communication in this entire system, which is very, very absurd. Language is the source of confusion and discomfort here. It does not connect. It does not operate as a bridge. It does not communicate. The only connection that both of them have are the connections in terms of the bodily connections, so to speak. Once Peter begins to feel liberated a bit when Jerry is tickling him. Yeah. So only in the context of such very inappropriate gestures, we find that they are able to connect with each other. So there is an absence of communication an absurdity which emerges from that, the entire play needs to be read within that as well. So the only connection that they eventually manage to establish happens only at the time of their death. Yeah, and there is no conversation at that point, just random exchanges, and there is a frenzy at that time, and there is shock, there's bewilderment, and it sums up what the play is entirely about. If you read through the play closely again, we find that it's impossible to find one strand of conversation over there. Sometimes there's even a lack of conversation, it's just an exchange of words, which causes a lot of confusion and a lot of discomfort. And the connect becomes possible, as mentioned, only at the end. And it's almost as if Jerry is driven to that point of connecting through death, because there's absolutely no way in which they could connect through the other means. So this absurdity can be seen as this sudden and arbitrary conversation or the lack of it. Yeah, and in the same way, the ending is almost like a parody. There's a sudden and arbitrary death, just like Jerry started this conversation in a very arbitrary way, without any context. We find that the death also happens without much of a context. Yeah, it's very sudden, it's very arbitrary. It's entirely futile to look for a reason, to look for a context, to try and understand why this happened. So the play in that sense is also teasing the reader, because our tendency as a reader is also to look for a reason, to find the rationale behind the various actions. This beats rationality in every way. This challenges the frontiers of what we consider as rational or irrational. So here Jerry dies for no reason. There's absolutely this death here does not arrive because of something. Death here does not happen because something else happened before. So the before and after that we are normally used to in conventional storytelling is entirely absent over here. So Peter, just like the reader, is left shocked and baffled at the end of it, trying to make sense of it. In fact, Jerry even articulates this at some point in the play, asking the reader as well as Peter, are you trying to make sense of this? Yeah, is your mission there's this innate tendency in Peter's class-ridden society, as well as in the way in which we try to read the plays. Are you trying to make sense of these random things, because there is no sense at all? So we find that the absurdity is there, getting performed to the core. This is another Waiting for Godot moment, where whatever happens, there is nothing which is happening, and there is a notion of something about to happen, and there's a forced kind of action, a forced kind of murder which happens over there. The death here almost becomes like a sacrifice, as mentioned in the earlier session. So there are a lot of undertones of sexuality. The fact that Jerry cannot disclose his sexuality. He does not even utter the word homosexual. He spells it out. And there is a lot of trauma. There's a lot of shame behind that identity. He's hiding behind many things. We find that, there is perhaps an inhibition from Peter's side to engage with. So in the play also we can find right at the outset, there is a mention of Freud, where, when they're talking about when Jerry is seeing Peter smoking, preparing his pipe to smoke, and he mentions lung cancer and then asks, then you'll have to wear one of those things Freud wore after they took one whole side of his jaw anyway. So this reference is not entirely out of context. So despite this absurdity, the theme of absurdity that this play foregrounds, we find that it's very carefully crafted. There is nothing over here which is included by way of an accident. There's nothing which is not really fitting into the theme or the larger context. Freud finds a mention over here, which also corroborates very well with the undertones of sexuality. This the play also foregrounds at various points. So the bench over here becomes a marker, becomes this symbol of power. There's a tussle for power. The bench, though there is a certain, it's a common public property. Yeah, it is out there for anyone to access it, but still we find that it is part of the privilege which belongs to the rich, the leisure, the space where some kind of socializing happens. That's all part of the privileges which are accorded to the rich. And this is also something that this play is challenging through the figure of Jerry. And this expression, "oh my God," which gets repeated towards the end of the play multiple times without really a context. Sometimes we even feel that Jerry is trying to parody the anxiety and the stress out of which Peter keeps uttering, "oh my God." Yeah. So here, you could also, connect this with some divine plan in a very abstract sense, because Jerry also says whether, he also half admits perhaps, he planned this in such a way, and he's also, becoming his own God in that sense, trying to orchestrate these series of events, yeah, in such ways that it almost befalls Peter like a divine plan out of which he has no respite, out of which he cannot escape. And his role is also predetermined over here, because Jerry uses him as a pawn. So Peter's role in this is predetermined. There's no free will that he can exercise in this whole exercise. Yeah. And we find that this expression, the repetition of this expression, becomes meaningless as well as very abstractly profound simultaneously. Yeah. So if we may quickly go through the play and take a look at some of the segments which are also interesting, particularly the instance where he begins to talk about the situation with the dog, which is also at the center of this play. So we will quickly take a look at that instance and wrap up this session as well. So he first introduces a landlady in such in very mean ways: a fat, ugly, mean, stupid, unwashed, misanthropic, cheap, drunken bag of garbage. So we find that here language becomes a tool, a medium through which he's venting out his anger too. And the story that he now begins to narrate about the dog, is also in some way replicating what he is facing, he's going through in his mind. So he gives a title to the story, and he reads it out as almost it's visible out there on a huge billboard: the story of Jerry and the dog. Yeah. So the dog is being described as a black monster of a beast, yeah, with oversized head, tiny ears and eyes, bloodshot, infected maybe, and a body you can see the ribs through the skin. Yeah. Here the dog becomes a symbol, a manifestation, an embodiment of all the horrors that Jerry has faced in his life. And if you go through these descriptions, you will find that it's very graphic in nature in terms of the details which we are consuming from here. And it says, this dog wasn't indifferent from the beginning. He'd snarl and then go for me to get one of my legs. Not like he was rabid. He was sort of a stumbly dog, but he wasn't half-assed either. It was a good stumbly run, but always got away. So it's a very intimate story that he is narrating over here, where we also, it's possible for us to interpret that maybe the dog becomes everything in his life which is trying to chase him, and everything in his life that he's going to fight and somehow struggle and survive. So he keeps saying, he keeps evaluating the choices that he had, and he's also sharing those with Peter, much to his horror. First, I'll kill the dog with kindness, and if that doesn't work, I'll just kill him. And of course, Peter winces at the very thought of it. And then, in between, he gives another detailed encounter, very graphically detailed account of this encounter with the dog, and says he actually decided to kill the dog. And then Peter raises a hand in protest, because this is completely against his social conditioning, completely against the moral fabric within which, he leads his life, completely against the value system which dominates him. He says he decides to kill, but don't be so alarmed, I didn't succeed. The day I tried to kill the dog, I bought only one hamburger. And then, he talks about, I thought it was a murderous portion of a rat poison, and then the dog falls sick. And we also took a look at that session where, he's also being asked by the landlady to pray for the dog, and we did see in the last session what his response was. Yeah. So the point is here, the dog story becomes very central. Yeah. We're also coming to the crux of this play as we are wrapping up this session too. The dog story becomes very central to this play, because this is also about the ways in which Jerry as well as Peter by extension, are trying to connect with each other and fails miserably in two different ways altogether. So Jerry says, it's just that if you can't deal with people, you have to make a start somewhere with animals. A person has to have some way of dealing with something. So ultimately, this is just a symbol. The dog becomes just a symbol. The park bench becomes just a symbol. These conversations become just random kind of tools that they use to connect with each other. Ultimately, there is this need to connect, and if you can't start with people, you start with something, with an animal, yeah, or with a bed, with a cockroach, a mirror, yeah. So you just start with anything. And he also says that's too hard. The mirror, that's one of the last steps, because mirror is in fact, it's replicating your own persona. Even a cockroach is better than just having no one other than oneself, yeah. So you find the intense pathos within which this is located as well. The world of both these men look very similar in uncanny ways. Both of them, on a Sunday afternoon, they have nowhere to go, nowhere else to go, no other person to connect with. Yeah, so he's sitting there with a book, and Peter is sitting there with a book, and Jerry is just walking around with a story, or what he thinks is a story, waiting for another person to share it with. Yeah, so if you also, there is this sense of shock and sense of surprise in Peter, which we also share. This wasn't the kind of afternoon I'd anticipated. There's something very predictable, very routine-like about Peter's life, which is being completely thwarted. And we find the violence. It's difficult not to see the violence inherent in this, but we also find that it's sad in a certain way, this predictability within which he is stuck, from where, he has nowhere to go either. So they are both quite pathetic in similar ways, and we find that, as we discussed before, Jerry in fact is liberating him through this final encounter of violence. He's the one who starts off this quarrel, the beginning of fight, the fight that starts, about the bench. I want this bench. And then Peter is also equally adamant. I sit on this bench almost every Sunday afternoon in good weather. It's secluded here. There's never anyone sitting here, so I have it all to myself. Yeah. So you don't know whether it's his privilege or his isolation which is at work over here. And it's very open-ended in that sense. It does not give us a sense of closure except by way of death. And Peter, in fact, Peter is driven to a certain irrational mode of acting over here by Jerry. And this is also to show that there's very little difference between these two men. And when driven to a point, when encountered with such unnatural circumstances, even Peter is capable of this insanity, this kind of violence, this kind of irrational behavior. Ultimately, the play is also showing that both of them, though they inhabit very different contrasting worlds, as we saw at the beginning, that's just a superficial layer. Beneath that, they're just two human beings, two men with a lot of isolated feelings, and they're all trying to connect in some form or the other. And for them to, anything that borders on a kind of a connection, there's also a tendency for it to become violent, because intimacy also becomes something very violent over here, as we would see. And towards the end, it's entirely irrational. And Jerry is trying to foreground that irrationality when he says, you have everything in the world you want. You've told me about your home, your family, your own little zoo. So that is also seen as a zoo, yeah, where everything is organized, everything is compartmentalized, yeah. There's no way in which you can expect any natural order there. It's very carefully manicured and crafted. You have everything, and now you want this bench. Are these the things men fight for? Tell me, Peter, is this bench, this iron and this wood, is this your honor? Is this the thing in the world you'd fight for? Can you think of anything more absurd? So we clearly see that Peter is not the kind of person who can fight for anything. He's not the kind of person, who can do anything which is out of the way, which is out of his ordinary routine. And here Jerry is also challenging him, provoking him further, very deliberately. We would know towards the end. I'll have to give you credit for one thing. You are a vegetable, and a slightly nearsighted one, I think. And he's provoking him to fight, and he does do that. And eventually we find that Jerry impales on the knife at the end of Peter's firm arm. The knife is literally thrust on him, and he impales on the knife, and then of course, he meets with his end. So towards the end, yeah, there's also a certain validity that Jerry gives to Peter. Of course, he allows Peter to run away to save his life and his reputation. You've lost your bench, but you've defended your owner. And Peter, I'll tell you something now. You're not really a vegetable. It's all right. You're an animal. And we're quite certain that till the end of Peter's life, this would be perhaps the most intimate connection that he made with another human being. And towards the end, he's also, mimicking Peter. Hurry away, your parakeets are making the dinner, the cats are setting the table. And Jerry continues, yeah, oh my God, yeah, maybe we don't know whether it's sarcastic, we don't know whether it's a parody, we don't know whether he is calling out to God, yeah, but he is dead, yeah. So he calls out to God and then he's also dead. So this is also a very interesting way in which the absurdity over here works. So we find that, this is also generally seen as, one of those very few works from within the American theatre, from within the productions of the American theatre, which is seen as intricately, intensely absurdist in nature. Yeah? So with this, we come to the end of this session, and I hope that you got an idea of how to read this play closely and also how to situate this within various critical frameworks. So thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing you in the next session.